fall and winter, what happens is all of the life force of the prairie plant community retreats underground. Everything above ground is dead, dormant thatch. Most of the plant material, the living tissue, the biomass of the prairie, is below the soil surface. While this grass and leaves might be 6 to 8 feet tall, the root structure down below might be 15 or 20 feet long. And because of that, prairies are sometimes called upside-down plant communities. But of equal importance, because that grass is dead, and because that grass is dry, there's not active physiology pulling the moisture around in the stems, this grass is susceptible to burning. And if you think about American history, we've all read about those huge sweeping wildfires that once passed across the plains. It turns out those fires contribute a critical element to prairie ecology. Grasslands all around the world need to be burned in order to be healthy. And initially that doesn't make sense. You have to ask yourself, how could burning something make it healthier? We'll dig into that discussion a little more as we go on here. So, prairies once were the Houston area's dominant landscape feature. It's hard to believe that today, prairies are one of the most critically imperiled habitats in North America. Only 1% of coastal tallgrass prairies still survives. And that's a big, potent headline. 99% of coastal prairies have disappeared. So to make that statement, we have to explore, where have all the prairies gone? And to understand that, again, we have to go back in time. This is the largest land animal in North America. The American bison weighs about 1,500 pounds. And we believe at their peak population, there were about 60 million of them in North America. 60 million. So that's a lot of animals, a lot of big animals. And this is what this image shows what they did almost all day long. So this kind of population makes it hard for us to understand what kinds of effects they might have had and how big those herds might have actually been. I'm going to read another excerpt to you here out of the book that describes one of those early encounters with the bison herd. I realize here it is. 1869, coming across a large bison herd. One night in June, we set out on a scouting expedition to protect frontier settlements along Buffalo Creek. All night long, the guards reported hearing the roar of the buffalo herd. In the stillness of the bright morning, it sounded more like distant thunder than anything else it could be compared with. It was the tramping of the mighty herd and the moaning of the bulls. When we reached the top of the bluff, what a bewildering scene awaited our gaze. As far as the field glasses would carry the vision towards the blue hills, there was a moving black mass of buffalo, all traveling slowly northwest at a rate of about 1 to 2 miles an hour. The northeast side of the line was about 1 mile away from us, but all other sides, beginning and ending, were undefined. They moved deliberately and undisturbed, which told us that no Indians were in the vicinity. Many times the question came to mind, how many buffalo were in that herd? And the answer no one could tell. The herd was not less than 20 miles in width. We never saw the other side, which meant that it must have been at least 60 miles long, maybe much longer. We estimated 2 counties of buffalo. So imagine trying to estimate the size of a bison herd by comparing it to your home county. Imagine you saw a bison herd the size of Harris County. Imagine there was a continuing herd of bison from Galveston to Conroe. That gives us a beginning to understand what a critical influence in the ecology these types of animals were. So we've got a Harris County-sized herd of bison. They're doing this. They're grazing. They're moving across this huge expanse of grassland. And let's just say I'm at the leading edge, the front edge of that big moving mass. I've got access to the best tasting plants. And there's another new concept. We really don't think about the fact that grazing animals have preference plants. Cowboys call those ice cream plants. Cows have ice cream plants too. These are grasses that have more sugar, more protein, they're easier to chew, they just taste better. So if we're at the leading edge of this Harris County-sized herd of bison eating all the ice cream plants in front of us, but you guys in the back are at the very end of that herd, what's left for you to eat are trees, shrubs, twigs, sticks, very low preference plants. But if you don't eat it, it means you go hungry. So what happens is this huge herd had a very high intensity grazing strategy, but the herd keeps moving. Because we're always looking for more foliage to eat. And that means the prairie behind us had a recovery period. It had a chance to rest from the grazing pressure. It had a chance to regrow grass after the herd was gone for weeks, months, or years. We don't know when it may have been grazed again. And by the way, that's very different than what happened when we moved to Texas and built permanent barbed wire grazing pastures for cows. That's almost the opposite strategy. Now we put large cattle, grazing animals, in this permanent fixed pasture. And every time those ice cream plants grow a new 3 inches of leaf material, cow comes back to and eats it day after day after day. So that's a phenomenon ecologists refer to as overgrazing. And essentially what that means is those ice cream plants and grasses ultimately disappear. A plant has to have leaf matter to photosynthesize to produce those sugars so that it can endure this kind of pressure. And if not, it won't survive. So bison had a high intensity, low frequency grazing strategy as they moved across the prairie. But remember, our discussion now is, where have all the prairies gone? 1% remains. We start with the bison because bison almost completely disappeared. By the end of the 1860s, in an effort to subdue Native American uprisings, we removed their major food source, which was the bison. And by the end of the 1860s, less than 2,000 of those 60 million still survive. Bison are considered a keystone species in prairie ecology. That's a term that ecologists use for an animal that plays such a significant role in ecology that if it's removed, then the entire plant community begins to change. So where have all the prairies gone? The bison, a keystone species, disappeared. Back in the early days, in addition to bison, fire played a critical role in grasslands. I mentioned its importance in grasslands around the world, and in those early days, these fires were largely ignited by lightning strikes. A lightning bolt would hit the land, it would travel great distances, hundreds of miles, until it encountered a natural fire break. The Gulf of Mexico, a major lake, I used to say a major river system, but in 2011, we had that huge drought. Bastrop, Texas, not very far from us, had a huge fire. I don't know if you guys remember 2011, the Bastrop fire or not. The conditions were so idyllic for fires in 2011 that the Bastrop fire jumped across the Colorado River, one of the major river systems in Texas. So when conditions are just right, we really don't know what will stop these fires. I said that in the early days, they were ignited by lightning strikes. In more modern times, as humans migrated across the land bridge into North America, we had native peoples all around Galveston Bay. This is an excavation of a burial of a group of people called the Arcotesis. This is an Indian tribe that lived at Armand Bayou Nature Center. And these people moved a hand-to-mouth existence. They walked from Galveston Bay up into Armand Bayou, down to Galveston Island, seasonally, following their food supply. They came to Armand Bayou every spring and summer to feast on the berries and wildlife, but mainly on the clams that lived in the bayou. And because they traveled so widely, you might imagine what it would be like to walk through that picture of 6-foot-high grass. That's tough going. So as humans moved into North America, they began to use fire as a tool for lots of different reasons. One of them was to ease their migratory movement. You burn the prairie before you walk through it. It's very easy going as opposed to walking through that dense, thick grass. Indians also recognized that once the fire is gone, That new tender regrowth of vegetation is very attractive to grazing animals, which they like to hunt and eat. Today, however, fires are suppressed all around North America. Fires are dangerous to us. They're dangerous to our homes and businesses. So where have all the prairies gone includes a discussion that grasslands are a fire-dependent ecosystem, and today, as human population has increased around Texas, fires no longer occur with any frequency. Where have all the prairies gone also includes the discussion of invasive species. An invasive species is a plant or animal that's brought from one part of the planet to its new home. In this case, the Chinese tallow, brought from China to the Houston area in the 1950s as a landscape plant. It's pretty good around the house. It's hard to kill. It grows in any kind of soil, has nice fall color, but when it escapes, and when it enters into a sensitive ecological area like a coastal prairie, it wreaks real havoc. What often happens is that invasive species have a long list of adapted strategies that allow it to outcompete the native plants. They don't play well with their neighbors. The Chinese tallow tree can live in any kind of soil, sandy soil, clayey soil, salty soil. It grows very rapidly. It exudes a very toxic, white, milky sap, which means insects don't eat it, means animals don't eat it. And an adult tree this size can make about 10,000 seeds a year. Those seeds can live for about a decade in the soil. So that's a long list of those adaptive strategies that I was describing to you. And the problem is, when it enters a sensitive ecological area like a prairie, is that it competes with its neighbors. That's a concept we don't think about frequently, is plants competing. Plants move so slow. It's a lot more boring than a basketball game. It's hard to follow exactly what's happening. But what's happening in this prairie is competition for resources, particularly for sunlight. And as you see this Chinese tallow tree right in the center of the picture, you also see native oaks in the background. You see dark green yopons. This is a picture of woody plants competing for sunlight, and over time, the prairie not being managed by fire, not being exposed to grazing animals, not having any influence from a land manager such as myself, what becomes of that diverse prairie plant community is it's replaced by this single species of non-native tree, the Chinese tallow tree. So over about a 20-year period, these tallows create a closed canopy. That's where each tree's top kind of touches its neighbor. And as a result, all of the sunlight is harvested in the upper canopy. And all of those prairie grasses and wildflowers are shaded out of existence, essentially making it a biological desert by comparison to what it was. If you've ever driven down Bay Area and Red Bluff Road, this is a little better image of what portions of the nature center look like at the peak of our Chinese tallow area. This is probably 1995. San Jacinto College last year planted right about in this area. Of course, those tallows are all gone now, but it was a very different scene with our tallow invasion in the recent past. It was pretty remarkable how quickly these trees can colonize and dominate an area. Just below the red line on the left, you see that prairie has no trees in it. And in just a few decades, that same prairie that's sitting on the right, you see is largely that closed canopy tallow forest. So around here, where have all the prairies gone also includes the fact that this is all valuable real estate. Anywhere there's a for sale sign on a prairie, it means likely that that diverse plant community is going to become businesses, industries, or a new subdivision for us to live in. So in the mid-1990s, we began to recognize that just the preservation of the place was not adequate to really maintain what we had. You remember Armand and Hannah and the preservation effort, which was the first critical step for long-term preservation. But we had hoped that just building that fence around the perimeter of the place would enable Mother Nature to do the rest. And it turns out that was not the case. It turns out that the new wild actually includes the fact that humans, on occasion, have to assist the ecology to bring back the natives. And that's really what the science of restoration ecology is bringing back the native plants, bringing back the native animals, and of equal importance, bringing back those historic processes, the ecological influences that bison once had, and the critical role that fire plays in the landscape. So in the mid-1990s, we undertook an ambitious effort to begin to remove and eradicate those Chinese tallow trees. To do it, we had to recognize what it takes to do a restoration project. Restoration is always a human activity. It begins with people. Someone somewhere has to decide we're going to take action and try to improve the ecology of the place. How do we do that? Well, hopefully you make a well thought out plan. The Nature Center has a natural resource management plan posted on our website, details all of our various activities in all three of those ecosystems. Once you've developed that plan, hopefully you can take it somewhere and get a grant or find a donor to help you get funding to hire a staff and to purchase the equipment that you need to do that. 4 square miles is a pretty big place. It's a pretty big job. So without all of these components being in place, it's hard to really implement that project of bringing back the natives. 1997, 98, we made a difficult decision to actually spray herbicide out of a helicopter. This is a practice that's used in areas where invasive species have taken hold widespread. So we sprayed 300 acres of this herbicide on Chinese tallow closed canopy forest. When I was a student here, one of the books we read and studied was a book called Silent Spring. That was a book that detailed problems with chemicals in the environment, particularly a chemical called DDT, which was an insecticide that was in wide use around the U.S. We sprayed it on our crops and farmlands. It washed out into waterways, and ultimately it bioaccumulated and became more and more toxic as it moved up the food chain to the apex predators, particularly to bald eagles, peregrine falcons, brown pelicans. Long list of birds at the top of the food chain began to suffer reproductive effects from DDT. So there was a lot of concern at that time when I was kind of forming my understanding and beliefs about the environment, about chemicals generally being a bad thing in the environment. Well, this was not an easy decision, but the laws and regulations had changed, chemicals had improved, and we had to decide that if we did nothing and let the tallows take control of the prairie, we'd likely lose its ecology anyway. So we sprayed these 300 acres of tallow from a helicopter. As they began to die in the upper canopy above me here, one of the things you notice below me is that abundant seed resource that's in the soil. Those are Chinese tallow seed that is sprouting underneath the dead, dying adult trees above me. So this is where the more long-term management comes into play. No magic bullet to immediately eradicate Chinese tallows. We followed up with an approach of this big machine which mows the trees down. It's a big chipper which turns those dead, dying trees into wood mulch. Of course, with the long-term goal being to bring back the natives. This was kind of a hard concept for people driving around the Nature Center to understand. The late 1990s is when cell phones were really just beginning to come into popular use. People would drive around the boundaries of the Nature Center, and they'd see us mowing all the trees down. And they'd say, what the heck is going on out there, and what is Kramer thinking about? So the phone would ring. People would be driving down the road. The woman at the front desk would answer the phone and connect with me. But this is a very difficult story to tell in 20 or 30 seconds on a cell phone. I think today humans generally have a better understanding of what wildlife management, resource management, invasive species are about. As those seeds continue to germinate, you can see this image in the top left. We have to continue follow-up treatments and long-term management in that effort to bring back the natives. The plan includes the fact that we have management units and a schedule of activities such as